First of all, this event is so amazing. I'm honored to be here. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Jay and D-Day and everyone who's made this event happen. It's really incredible to see all of these people thinking and talking about science. So I love it. Okay, I'm here to talk about not only coral reefs, but this amazing reef system that we have right in our backyards, the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary. And I'm going to talk to you about ongoing research looking at the impacts of extreme storms on that system. So actually, let me back up, because there were so many kids and students out there. I was going to say this at the end, but I want to say it right now. With all the elementary schools and high schools and university groups here, if you are someone who loves marine science or science, and you've thought about doing that for your career, do it. If that's your passion, don't give up. Keep going. We need you. So that's my point 0. And then my 3 main points that I've listed here are, first of all, coral reefs are these incredibly valuable biodiverse systems. And unfortunately, many of them are also in decline. That's something I want you to take away from tonight. Extreme storms, like Hurricane Harvey, for example, are a stressor that can potentially impact reefs through a lot of different ways, and I'll talk to you about those. And if we want to look, if we want to try to limit or mitigate impacts to reefs, stop them from declining, then we really need interdisciplinary teams. And that's part of what was so cool with all these tables out here. You know, practically a whole bunch of the pieces of the team that we would need to tackle the effects of storms on a system like reefs was here tonight. So I wish I'd had more time to talk with everyone. Okay, so reefs are these living habitats. They form massive limestone structures that you can see from space that span hundreds of kilometers, and they're made out of these individual coral colonies that you can see here. And the workhorse in those coral colonies are these individual polyps that Jay showed you the skeletons of. These individual polyps are photosynthesizing, dividing, and making limestone that builds the reef structure. So inside that limestone structure on a reef, we have about 1 million marine species that call that home. So corals are sort of building cities, which are the reef, and then there are about 25% of all the marine species that we know of in the world are living in those cities. And that's particularly amazing because reefs cover a very small portion of the seafloor. In fact, they cover about less than 1% of the seafloor. So lots of biodiversity in a very small space. And when you've got such a biodiverse system doing so many things, it's really not surprising that there's a significant economic value to humans from these systems as well. So annually around the world, reefs contribute more than $30 billion to the world economy each year. And that's, you know, if you're thinking about the impact or the benefits that we get from tourism and recreation, from protecting our shorelines from erosion, from supporting robust fisheries, and from other types of biodiversity that live on reefs. So for example, you may have heard that we can get medicinal compounds from some reef organisms, like sponges. So there are different kinds of corals all around the world. You may have heard of deep water corals or cold water corals. They can live in lots of places, but the sort of shallow water coral reef system that might spring to your mind with a diver swimming over it in a bathing suit or something like that, that's a tropical coral reef, probably. All of these dots on this map are coral reefs around the world. And you know, basically, where are they mostly? Can anybody tell me? Near the equator, yeah. So the equator is at 0 degrees latitude. Most reefs are between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. So within this yellow band. When I say coral reefs in the United States, what do you think of? Florida, Caribbean. Somebody said Flower Garden Banks. Oh yeah. Thank you. Yeah, but a lot of people might say Hawaiian Islands, American Samoa, Virgin Islands, Florida Keys, definitely. We have 11 national marine sanctuaries in the United States. Those aren't the only places where we have coral. And in fact, of those 11 national marine sanctuaries, we only have coral reefs in 5 of them that I bolded here. And one of those is the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary. And that's right here. So in this upper, in this upper inset map, you can see the Texas and Louisiana coast. And then these little blue dots in this rectangle that's zoomed out here, you can see the 3 banks that are currently in the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary. And those are called, creatively, the East Bank and the West Bank and Stetson Bank. But you can also sort of see, where this drop-off occurs in the light areas. You can see these little additional patches, right? And that's on those places, we have other valuable coral communities and sometimes little reefs. So what's currently inside the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary is not the full extent of the coral resources that we have here off in the northwest Gulf of Mexico. So hopefully there's a proposed boundary expansion process that's going on right now for the Flower Garden Banks, and hopefully some of this additional valuable coral and marine organism diversity will get captured inside of this National Marine Sanctuary. Okay, so now, how many people have been lucky enough to dive on the Flower Garden Banks? Has anybody here been there? Okay, that's awesome. I bet that you guys loved it. For the rest of you who haven't seen it, now I'm going to take you on a little dive, a quick dive, hopefully. Oop, maybe not. Yes. Okay, so here you can see all of these coral colonies that are making up the Flower Garden Banks. Look at how many colonies you can see. There are some macroalgae that's leathery. This orange and red stuff is sponges or crustose coral and algae. But most of this, look at the incredible 3-dimensional structure that these stony corals are building out of their skeletons. All of these cracks and crevices are the places where those other 1 million species can live, right? This 3-dimensional structure is also what, on shallower coastal fringing reefs, is taking the brunt of wave action and protecting shorelines from wave energy. So, lots and lots of healthy coral cover here. And unfortunately, when we compare that to coral reefs over time in the rest of the Caribbean or Atlantic, we now see a very different picture on average throughout the Caribbean. So this graph, this is year on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have % of living stony coral cover, right? So how much of the reef bottom, maybe you saw the Flower Garden Banks that folks from Rice brought, and we talked about how you could calculate % coral cover on those reefs using that simple plastic square, right? When you take those measurements, you can get this % living coral cover, which is a metric of how healthy your reefs are. How much coral do you have? You want to have a lot. So these 2 lines represent synthesis studies that have gone out and looked at all sorts of research done by all kinds of scientists over time that have gone to a reef in Barbados and a reef in the Florida Keys and a reef in the Virgin Islands and reefs, all over, and figured out how much stony coral cover was there at a particular time. And when you summarize all of that, unfortunately what you get is this average declining curve where we've lost a lot of our coral cover over time on many reefs. So on average, we've gone in the Caribbean from about 50% live coral cover to about 8%. Yeah. And now, this is just, I showed you on that last video the amazing Flower Garden Banks. Now I'm going to show you how amazing it is on this graph. So if you take % coral cover in the Flower Garden Banks and superimpose it onto this graph where it fits for the appropriate years, that's where it is, way up there, right? So we currently have in the Flower Garden Banks, that's an example from West Bank, but it looks the same for East. We currently have the kind of % average coral cover there that we only had back in the 70s on average for reefs across the Caribbean. So the Flower Garden Banks, I can't underscore enough, especially to Texans, how amazing and valuable this reef is. And when when you have a decline in coral cover like this, you're losing the traits of the ecosystem. The things that the coral reef does changes. So on a healthy reef, like the Flower Garden Banks that has abundant living stony corals, you have all those spaces, you have the three-dimensional structure, and all of those organisms are living inside of it. And those corals are they can support robust fisheries, and people want to go there and dive and fish, right? When you have healthy reefs that are close to shore, like along a coast, that's not the Flower Garden Banks, but in a coastal area, those healthy corals are also going to let the waves break on the reef crust, and then most of that wave energy is not going to hit the actual sandy beach. In a degraded reef system, the corals start dying. Yes, the limestone skeleton is still there for a bit, but gradually, since no more limestone is getting made, storms and other things start breaking those corals apart. You lose that three-dimensional structure, and you lose all the homes for all those other species. So you start losing the biodiversity. You can have reduced fish. You start losing your fisheries and your ecotourism, and then waves are breaking. Instead of breaking out on the reef, they're breaking on the shoreline, and you have erosion. So you really lose not only, as you lose the coral, you start losing the ecosystem functions that coral reefs provide. And there are a whole bunch of things that are causing declines in coral reefs. A whole bunch of different threats. Some of them are here, some of the really big ones. There's no way that I could or should talk about all of these in detail today, but I'll talk to you about 3 of them. I'll talk with you about warming oceans, which is a global problem causing coral bleaching. Maybe you've heard of coral bleaching. And then I'll talk with you about potential impacts of storms and terrestrial runoff, which can kind of go together, and those are local stressors. Okay, but before I can go into this global stressor of warming oceans, first I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna tell you about to me, what is one of the most fascinating parts of how this whole system works, because you need to know about it in order to understand coral bleaching. So here is a picture of a coral, and these individual circles are the coral polyps in this clonal animal. And this living tissue, the coral polyp, is sitting on top of this skeleton that Jay so kindly showed you. So it's just like a thin skin of the living tissue on top. But in that skin, that coral tissue, there is a whole wealth of different kinds of microbes, including bacteria and viruses and other things that live on and in the coral tissues. And so you can call these things symbionts or microbial symbionts. Symbiont just means something that lives in a long-term association with a host organism, like a coral. One of the symbionts that's really important and has been very well studied is this thing called Symbiodinium up here, this yellow-brown color. These symbionts are very, very abundant inside coral tissues. There can be 1 to 2 million in a square centimeter of coral tissue. And it's this yellow-brown of the Symbiodinium that's giving corals most of its typical coloration. So Symbiodinium is important because it photosynthesizes and makes sugars, and then it gives a lot of those sugars to the animal tissue. And that's a big part of the energy that the coral animal uses to lay down these massive limestone structures. And then at the same time, this coral animal is giving back by providing a stable environment for the Symbiodinium to live in, and providing it with some nutrients. Okay, so when you look at this and you're thinking about corals and microbes, it might be like, okay, well, that's nice, but how important can they be? Now when we think about human health, we can sequence the genome of a human, right? And try to understand how all of our genetic material contributes to our health, right? Or lack of health. But now we understand that you also need to look at all of the microbes that you have on and in your body to get a full picture of whether, how you might be in terms of health and physiology. So We have microbes associated with our skin, with our eyeballs, with our mouths, with our digestive tracts. And we now know that these microbes in our own guts are critically important for extracting calories from the food we eat, right? And if we have different microbes in our guts, sometimes that can lead to problems for us, right? So there's a growing understanding that there are these microbial symbionts associated with all organisms and that they can play really important roles in our physiology. So corals, just because now I have to plug corals again. Corals are really incredible because, humans have lots of different kinds of bacteria living on and in them. Corals have lots of different kinds of all of these different groups of microbes. So people have started realizing that corals might be one of the most diverse symbiotic systems that there is. So you can imagine these things can all be interacting with each other and with the coral animal. So it gets complicated. But anyway, what we need to focus on for now to think about ocean warming is the relationship between coral and its symbiodinium. So here is a healthy reef. It's got this yellow-brown coloration from the symbiodinium in December of 2014, before this global coral bleaching event hit this reef. So what happens is you've got all of these polyps on the outside of the limestone skeleton of the corals, and you've got the symbionts living inside. And then temperatures exceeded a threshold that this relationship, this partnership, could tolerate. And these symbiodinium ended up getting kicked out of their coral. So now you can see the same reef is suddenly stark white. That is not a good color to see on a coral reef. And the reason this looks white, the coral is not dead. Things can go either way. It can recover or it can die from this point. But right now what you're seeing is the white limestone skeleton through the basically transparent coral tissues. And so you're seeing the white skeleton through, and it's not, you don't see any more of this golden brown of all the symbionts because they've left. So at this point, you have about 4 to 6 weeks to recover new symbiodinium and stay alive and return to hopefully normal function. Or sometimes what happens is these corals will not be able to recover their symbiont communities. They might get diseased. They might just get overgrown by other organisms that want that prime real estate of the ocean floor. And so even though this looks nicely darkly pigmented again, now what's happened is the corals are dead and these algae have overgrown the skeletons. So eventually, because this calcium carbonate is not being renewed and added to anymore by the corals, this will start breaking apart. Once you get here, it's hard to go back. So with this global coral bleaching event, it doesn't mean that one particular reef was bleached for 2 years from 2014 to 2016. But what it does mean is that reefs around the world were experiencing this warming seas stress continuously for a 2-year period, which is really unheard of. So some reefs somewhere around the globe were in a bleaching state for about a 2-year period. And here you can see, if you ever want to see amazing views of reefs, but also be taken aback by the extent of this bleaching event, you can go to www.globalcoralbleaching.org. And this Caitlin Seaview survey has documented, really for the first time on a large scale, what happened during this bleaching event. So they would go to a reef, they would take a picture of the corals when they were bleaching, and then they would come back and take the exact same picture later to see what happened. So here you can see what's happened on a few of these reefs, and unfortunately, this is a situation where on this patch, the corals died and were overgrown by algae. And here's another example. You can kind of get a feel from these pictures how much coral there is and how it's all bleached. So here again, there may have been some corals that survived, but definitely up here at the top and elsewhere, many of these corals died. Oh, there we go. OK, so to try to give you a larger scale perspective, all of these reefs, all of this white that you can see, those are bleached corals. So just the sheer enormity of this event was really unheard of in terms of the span of time that it continued. It's just massive amounts of corals that were experiencing this stress all at the same time. We lost 25% of corals in the Indian Ocean. 98% or more of corals bleached in some places in the Great Barrier Reef. And in some places in the Great Barrier Reef, 50% of the corals that bleached then died. So that was a significant event. Okay. So if you weren't aware of coral bleaching before and some of this potential impacts from warming oceans, now you've seen a piece of that. But now I'm going to talk with you about extreme storms and what I've been starting to think about and starting to try to understand as we've had a variety of storms interact with Texas. So in Houston, we've had very exciting times recently with the weather. We had the Memorial Day flood in late May of 2015, and then the next year we had the Tax Day flood in April, and then we just had Hurricane Harvey, right? So once those storms were over, I pretty much immediately started thinking about, is this potentially going to impact the flower garden banks, and in what ways? And although there's clear relevance for, our local reef, and thinking about, this regional perspective here in Texas, also in terms of extreme storms, we're not the only ones who have been experiencing this. We had 6 major hurricanes. We had a very active 2017 Atlantic hurricane season. 6 of those major hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, and Maria, impacted reefs, including those within the United States. So Irma had significant impacts on both the Florida Keys and the Virgin Islands. Maria also caused significant problems. So we can think about these in a larger context as well, right? So the first thing that people often think of when they think about extreme storms and reefs is physical breakage, right? In a normal situation, reefs at the reef crest are out there taking the brunt of wave energy, right? So when you dial that up in an extreme storm, there can be reef areas getting just absolutely pounded by very large waves and sometimes getting broken or toppled into pieces. Let me show you this video quickly. So here you can see some impacts that were observed by teams of researchers following Irma in the Florida Keys. And beyond the breakage, which I'll show you in a second, sort of one of the first things that you can immediately see is it's very white, right? So there were loads of fine sediments that were deposited on these reefs after being stirred up by this storm system. And then here's some of the breakage that I was telling you about, and some of this area here. We're about to see some live coral in a second. There we go. But basically, you can have immense physical trauma following storms. And the sedimentation, so the physical breakage, it's easy to see. The sedimentation, I'm going to show you in a second how hard it is for corals to actually get rid of that, or other organisms that are living on the bottom. So these fine sediments, here we go, when they settle on the bottom, they can get stuck. Oops, kind of skipping a bit. They can get stuck in small pieces of algae and other things that coat the bottom. And you can see, here's like a human-sized hand trying to wave these sediments off, and it's not that easy to get rid of them, right? If you're a coral or a sponge or some sort of filter-feeding organism that gets semi-buried or completely buried in this kind of deposit, and you need to filter water or access sunlight to make your food, then it is a significant energetic expenditure to try to get this off, right? Or maybe you aren't able to get it off at all, and you're smothered and you die. So those are 2 direct physical impacts that storms can have on reefs that we often think about. Hold on, and now I'm very thirsty. Okay. The flower garden banks, though, in terms of those physical impacts, this reef starts pretty deep. The coral cap is at 60 feet, and then it just goes bigger, goes deeper. So with Hurricane Harvey, there were a couple, maybe 3 coral colonies that were reported as being toppled after the hurricane, but these physical impacts aren't really an issue. However, following some of these extreme events, and those events that I listed previously, only one of them was a hurricane, right? 2 of them were floods that were caused by cold front storm systems. But following these events, we sometimes have seen mass mortality on the reef. So here is a picture of some of the Flower Garden Bank's National Marine Sanctuary in the East Bank. And this really large coral colony has experienced some significant mortality on that surface. It's got this white bacterial mat growing on it. We saw this in 2016, and we started to wonder, it kind of occurred at about the same time that some storm-induced floodwater runoff was interacting with this area of the Gulf. And we started to wonder, hey, could extreme storms cause significant changes in water quality that make it all the way out to 100 miles offshore, that can possibly cause issues for reefs? So that's what we started to look at. When you are looking, in 2016, after the tax day floods, you see something like this, and it's very obvious that there's a lot of water involved in that event, right? And when it's there on the land, we're thinking about it, and we know it's causing problems, and we want to know how to fix those problems, right? But as soon as that water leaves where we're living, it's really easy to sort of forget about it. Let me quickly orient you to this map in case you're not used to looking at something like this. This is the Gulf of Mexico here in the swirling colors. Here's the Yucatan Peninsula. There's Houston up there. So the continental landmass is in brown. These colors are showing salinity. So down here, we've got normal ocean salinities of about, they typically are at 34 to 36 parts per thousand. And as you move this way towards the star that says East Bank, we move away from these hot colors, which are normal salinities for the ocean, and we start getting towards purple and white, which is very low salinity for what a reef would be accustomed to. So that white patch is immediately adjacent to Houston. So what happened was those floodwaters, when they ran off the land, they were so significant that they caused a salinity drop offshore. And you can see that as time goes on, from early July up through the beginning of August, that freshwater or that low salinity water is moving and interacting with the East Bank. Importantly, it doesn't really go too much west of there, at least for very long. So right around the time of that salinity movement, or those salinity changes, a group of recreational divers went out in this boat called the MV Fling, and they dropped down into the East Bank and immediately knew something was wrong. So the waters were hazy and greenish, not clear like they should be on a reef, and they saw, basically just carnage on the reef. On a bleaching event like those mass bleaching events I showed you, you can have, massive amounts of coral death, massive amounts of bleaching across the reef, but it's typically just, limited to that. With this event, it was kind of like the skeletons were still there, but the tissues were sort of falling off the coral colonies in some places. The sponges were sort of dissolving up, and even things like, mobile invertebrates, like this used to be an urchin that just sort of fell apart on the reef. Lobsters were climbing on top of coral colonies. This was a really massive event here, and this is this white mat. You can see here, this is some dead skeleton. So in the areas that were affected on the East Bank, it was a mess. And here you can see, again, sort of some pictures of normal-looking coral tissue, this white mat over dead areas. Here's coral skeleton with white mat surrounding it. And here's some sponge also that had this white mat. So that white mat definitely got us concerned. So we started thinking about, okay, if it probably was not physical damage, could this flooding event, have had sort of a delay of a couple of months, and then started, as waters moved, and then started impacting this bank? But when it's not physical damage, then you start thinking about these different ways that changed water quality could potentially influence the reefs. So, was it the low salinity that I described, reaching those organisms, interacting with the reef bottom, and basically causing organisms to swell and die? Did the waters lose oxygen? Did they contain pollutants? Because, all of that floodwater was picking up sewage, it was picking up fertilizer, it was picking up pollutants. Anything that got spilled in one of those events was moving into the ocean, right? Or it could have been a combination of those things, or possibly other factors. So these are some of the things that I've started thinking about and that we all have started looking for as a team, just to show you that in terms of water quality, it gets pretty complicated. So it could be that the floodwaters lowered ocean salinity, those waters moved over the reef, and the salinity change was just too great. The tissues swelled of those organisms, and they died. But another possibility is that some organisms on the reef did succumb to that low saline stress, and then they died, and then decomposing bacteria that live out there in the waters went crazy and started eating that dead tissue, respiring and breathing while they did it, and drawing down the oxygen, so that then suddenly you've got water out there on the reef that has low oxygen, and then other organisms started suffocating, right? So it's kind of like a snowball issue. Another possibility is that these floodwaters came, and because fresh water is less dense than salt water, these floodwaters came out onto the Texas shelf and just floated on top of the ocean water. And that freshwater cap, or that low salinity cap, prevented winds from mixing oxygen into the salt water below. And then as organisms respired in that salt water beneath the freshwater cap, there was an oxygen drawdown, and things suffocated. And then a final possibility, but still not the only one, and these aren't mutually exclusive, is that we had these nutrients or chemicals make their way out there and kill the organisms directly, or perhaps cause some sort of bacterial shift and disease. So although this recreational dive boat immediately reported what it was seeing to NOAA, and then the NOAA Galveston office really was amazing and quick in their response to send out a rapid cruise to try to take samples and measure look at water characteristics, et cetera. There were a lot of missing pieces to the story. We didn't know the start date. We didn't have samples of that area that experienced that mass death from before the recreational boat went out there. So basically, we're trying to look at the samples we have and understand things, but it's very difficult, right? We don't have the full picture. One thing that's for sure, when you have a significant flooding event, right, and you need to respond to it, you want to mitigate the impact of that flood, community is incredibly important. I had no idea. Our house flooded during Harvey, and I very naively, the day that we were able to return to the house, I thought that we would cut the drywall off and do all of this stuff by ourselves, and it would be, we'd do it in a couple of days. And then the first set of folks showed up to help us deal with everything, and I realized the incredible importance of having a great team. And it's the same thing if you're trying to mitigate the impacts of a flood on an ecosystem. If you're trying to understand how an ecosystem is going to respond to an event like this, you need a diverse and great scientific community working on the problem. So these questions that I'm talking with you about and some of the data and ideas I'm going to show you are the product of this diverse team, not just me. So these are just some of the folks that are leading this project. So what we've done with the 2016 flood, and then also before and following Harvey, is to go out to the reefs and try to look at what's going on with important species that live out there to understand what might have happened. So we looked at 2 sponge species, this giant barrel sponge, which really can become giant, and this elephant ear encrusting sponge, and then 2 species of corals that are some of the most dominant reef builders out there in the Flower Garden banks. So they were some of the ones in that video you saw that were making these massive, massive structures. And we went, and for example, in the 2016 event where we were seeing that mass death on the East Bank only, we would go to one of those affected colonies, and here's one that has a lesion sort of at the bottom. We would sample the coral tissue at that lesion site so that we could get not only a picture of the coral physiology at that place where it was dying, but also the microbial symbionts that were associated with that dying tissue. And then we would go 30 centimeters away in what looked like healthy tissue on that same colony and take another separate sample and look at the same things. And then we would go find a colony of the same species on the east bank that looked completely healthy, had no signs of lesions, and we took a sample from that too. And then for the 2016 event, we also went to the west bank that had no problems at all and sampled some colonies of the same species. And what we could do from those samples is look at the physiology associated with these apparently completely healthy colonies and try to understand, what's the normal snapshot of physiological activity in those corals or sponges, and what do their microbial semblance look like? And then we can compare it to these areas in these organisms that we know were affected. And we can look to see what's the same, and we can look to see what's different. And we can try to dissect out or tease out things that we saw here that suggest particular causes in those hypotheses I showed you. So are there bacteria that we know cause disease? Are there bacteria that are good at eating some kind of chemical? Are there bacteria that can handle low oxygen? Is there a physiological process going on in the coral or the sponge that indicates low salinity? So we are trying to do a lot of comparisons that way, and then pair it with actual measurements of the seawater right next to the reef whenever we can get it to just directly measure, is the oxygen low? What is the salinity, et cetera, et cetera. And then we also get the microbes that are living in that seawater wherever we sample for the seawater characteristics. And between all of that, we're kind of trying to come sideways towards a picture or at least some indicators of what happened. So we're still processing these data. And I'm not going to show you all of the different things that we're looking at, but I can give you an example of the types of data that we end up finding. So this is from August 2016, kind of immediately after we became aware of the East Bank mortality event. And this is bacterial communities that are associated with the water column. So each one of these vertical bars is one sample of the water column. And on the y-axis, you can see relative abundance of different groups of bacteria based on color. So although each of these vertical columns, each of these samples is somewhat different one from the other, you can still look at it and sort of see these general patterns, right? Dark purple, light purple, orange, blue, light green, right? And then we did the same thing for mid-water column depths, so middle of the water column. And we also took samples from deep in the water column down where the water would be interacting with the reefs. So is there anything that jumps out at you all about this? You can scream it out, huh? Yeah, less cyanobacteria. Sorry, I wasn't finishing drinking fast enough. Less cyanobacteria as you go deeper. Yes, an appearance of the delta proteobacteria as you go deeper. And then another one is, for example, this Merini microbia, this magenta one. This one is often associated with oxygen minimum zones. So when you see this one popping up, it provides a clue that we may have had low oxygen in these areas, right? So we need to find a lot of different clues from a lot of different types of data before we will have a final answer. But this is, based on what we're seeing so far, I can tell you preliminarily, decreased salinity alone was probably not enough to cause the East Bank mortality that we saw. And we're seeing multiple signals that low oxygen may have played a role. Okay, and then quickly, then comes Harvey, right? Here it is just dumping water on us for a very long time, for 3 days. This is my son sitting on our bed as water started coming in our house, and we were like, hey, this is great. Here's some clothes, stay on the bed. And then And then the water started getting deeper, and we left the house in a boat, and I was not taking pictures for that part. But crazily enough, that night we were getting text messages from my Brazilian husband family saying, hey, you guys are in the national news, like Harvey is getting reported, look at all this water, are you guys okay? And we were like, yeah, we're fine, but hilariously the picture they sent us was literally like on the corner of where our house was, so there's a lot of water once again. In Houston, following Harvey, 9 trillion gallons. And once again, here's the same sort of type of map that I showed you before, where hot colors, the blue is no data. But hot colors are indicating regular ocean salinity, including in what's at the Flower Garden Banks in September 2017. And as you move towards shore, you see this just huge, undescribably huge accumulation of low salinity water. So we put a team together to go out, quickly get those before samples before this mass moved out there so that this time we would have the before samples. And then we also were able to do a cruise in late October to see what was happening. I'll show you this very quickly.
At the 3 sites we visited, waters looked clear and we did not see any signs of a mass death event on the reef, which is a good thing. However, corals, sponges, and other organisms may still have been stressed by reduced water quality, and the samples we collected will help us determine that. We will be returning in April of 2018 to complete another series of sampling to determine what the extent of the impacts from Hurricane Harvey have been.
Okay, so hopefully you could see in that brief clip that the reef overall still had lots of living coral. It was not bleached or sloughing or anything like that, which is really great news. However, when you experience stress, we know this as being living beings. When you experience stress, it doesn't have to kill you to cause impacts. So we're still getting ready to analyze those samples to try to understand whether there were sort of sublethal effects that that event caused. So very quickly, people have talked about Hurricane Harvey as being a once-in-a-million-year hurricane. So you could wonder, like, okay, well, did we dodge a bullet with the Flower Garden Banks? Are we going to be okay? And yes, I am so relieved that water mass did not just move directly over the Flower Garden Banks after Harvey. But at the same time, when you look at our flooding history in Houston, I think this is an issue that we need to pay attention to and we need to work on because it certainly seems possible that we'll have more instances to deal with. So very quickly, here is Houston. Here's a map in 1940 of impervious surfaces, so concrete, pavement, anything that water cannot percolate through. And hot colors are lots of pavement. Cool colors are not too much pavement. So, basically what has happened is we are totally paving over the swamp very rapidly, right? We're covering everything in concrete, and it's very difficult for water, once it's there, to go anywhere except across this system, So I think some of the things that we need to start talking about, you hear often this sort of generalization that what we do on land impacts reefs. Even if you're in the middle of the country, the choices you make can impact coral reefs. I think this is a very real example of that, a very tangible example in that the way that we're developing our cities, if we're sprawling outward versus growing upward in apartment buildings, can have a very real impact on the amount of impervious surface we have. And when floodwaters arrive, where do they go and how quickly are they going there? So when floodwaters are moving very quickly, they can overwhelm stormwater management systems and cause significant damage. So there are lots of different ways that we could deal with this, but one simple thing that I talked with some folks about here is just locally, on a neighborhood scale, finding places where we can easily put in some areas that will catch and allow percolation of these stormwaters down into a drain or a catchment system rather than everything just rushing across the impervious surfaces. So, I wish that Texas 2050 and all of these interdisciplinary things that are happening here are like just the type of thing that I'm excited to think about in regards to this problem and how it could impact reefs. So I'm excited that's happening here. So in terms of take to the beach ideas, next time you go to the beach, remember, please, that we have this amazing coral reef ecosystem right in our backyard, the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, and it's really a jewel, and we should take care of it. Extreme storms have an impact not just on the land and on us, but they can potentially impact coastal marine systems in significant ways and complicated ways. And then finally, we need to engage all sorts of different groups and thinkers to solve these problems. And then just one more final plug. Anyone out there who wants to be a marine biologist, stick with it. Okay, so with that, thank you to everyone. Thank you to that team of scientists that's been working on these issues in the Gulf. And John Imbesi and Jake Emmert were also critical to making those cruises happen. So with that, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Adrienne. That was awesome. Thank you very much. All righty. You have the one more slide, and we will put the address to go to on Slido to ask questions. I see we already have some questions for the speaker. Let me just find where we are. Here we are. So this question comes from Anonymous. Feel free to type your name in, even if it's just your first name or your street name or your dance name or something like that. So Anonymous asks, why did you pick corals as a research area?
Oh, I am not sure. I think the first thing that I wanted to study in the oceans were cephalopods, so squid and octopus and cuttlefish. But I realized it was just really hard to find them. And then the first time that I went diving on a reef, I was like, oh, obviously. If not that, it would have been caves, Jay. So
okay.
I'm sure I would have gotten there.
What about cool. Underwater caves?
Yeah. Maybe part of it is I have always loved flipping over logs or rocks, or my dad tried to teach me fly fishing and I was terrible, so I would just put on waders and flip over things in the water. And I think, if you like doing that and you go to a reef, you shouldn't flip it over, but all the stuff is everywhere anyway, so it's amazing.
Okay, this question comes from Anonymous, who asks, do you have a favorite reef or sanctuary?
Ooh, Anonymous, you are giving me a hard time. The Flower Garden Banks? The Flower Garden Banks is extremely amazing. Of the places I have been, also the Northern Galapagos Islands are really amazing. And, the Western Australia, definitely the diversity there blew me away. But there are a bunch of places I haven't been yet that I think also could be contenders for my favorite reef.
The next question comes from Gucci Gang. I think this might be a collective question. What college courses are needed for a major in marine biology? I actually did not major in marine biology, so I am not sure. However, I took any marine science courses that I could find at my university. So often a school will have at least introduction to oceanography, something like a marine ecology course. But then just basically, I would say, especially today in science, get a broad background, because I sort of shied away from anything micro at the time that I was in undergrad. And then I discovered in graduate school that there are so many amazing molecular and microbiology toolkits that you can apply to understand these systems. So I would just say, learn everything you can. Cool. Audrey asks, are the neighborhood improvements a small move for water movement or significant?
Ooh, that's where anyone who is, working directly in this system, feel free to put their 2 cents in. I think that, I think it's very important for communities to be able to engage, for people to be able to do something. And I think if we all care about something and are acting collectively, then ultimately it can have a significant impact. But I think there are probably other things on a larger scale that are also really important to make immediate gains. So, building perhaps large reservoirs or catchment systems that are on a scale that's bigger than a neighborhood, or thinking about, more vertical growth rather than horizontal growth will also be really important.
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? Take it to scale. So I know we have someone here from the City of Austin's Department of Watershed Protection, and Chris. And so I think there's a rainwater collection scheme being making these gardens in people's homes. But how many of those are you planning to have a significant impact?
We'd like one on every house.
167,000, and then we'll make a dent. So yeah, but it's a small thing at every house. Every house does their share.
Yeah.
Cool. This question comes from a seal. Can oil spills affect coral reefs negatively?
Definitely a seal. Hello, seal. Yes, fortunately, the flower garden banks did dodge a bullet in terms of the Deepwater Horizon spill, right? But there were plenty of bottom communities that were negatively impacted by that spill. Something like when you have an oil spill or something like that where you're dumping a very toxic chemical into the water, particularly things that can't move away, so anything colonizing the bottom can potentially have major issues. Sorry.
Great. So many great questions on here. Here's one from Jimbo. On the map, it looked like reefs occurred more off the eastern edge of land masses. Is that the case, and why? Very observant.
Yeah. So yes, reefs do not tend to be on the western sides of continents because that's where you have upwelling. And so those are nutrient-rich waters coming up from depths. And what can happen in a nutrient-rich environment is that you tip the competitive balance away from corals winning to algae and other things that can handle a nutrient-rich environment winning. So, for example, in the Eastern Pacific, Darwin and others thought that there were no reefs at all. But then we realized, scientists, other people had known reefs were there for a long time. But scientifically, we realized that there are reefs in those areas, even with upwelling, but they tend to be, the growth is not as robust as in areas without upwelling.
Right. Now, this is the question that's come up to the top as the crowdsourced favorite question of everybody. It comes from Angie, and she asks, what is the easiest thing we can do to limit our impact on our reef, such as don't use fertilizer, et cetera?
I think it's really important to think about your consumption. So, whether it's plastics entering the ocean or greenhouse gases being emitted or, other issues, really a lot of it comes from us wanting to have a certain type of lifestyle. It can be really challenging even to go into a store and buy something that doesn't come with a bunch of packaging or that doesn't break immediately and then you have to throw it away and go buy another one. So I think even just keeping that in your mind and trying to adjust your daily life wherever you can, it's really difficult, but worth trying. And put a rain catchment system on your house.
Right on. So here's another popular question from Zach. What do you specifically do on your reef team? Wow, it's kind of open-ended.
Okay. So I am looking at the microbes that are symbionts on the corals. So bacteria, Symbiodinium, viruses that are living on the coral tissues. There's another person who's looking at that in the sponges, and then there's someone else who's looking at the physiology of the coral animal itself. And then there are folks who are focused more on the water column stuff. So it takes a lot of scientists to sort of even just do all of those different things within the team.
Cool. Kevin asked this question, have there been any efforts to use biological methods to remove algae or restore reefs? It's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, so what we need on reefs biologically to remove algae is we need fish and we need sea urchins. So those are the things that eat algae on reefs. I've spoken with some people who are talking about trying to basically develop aquaculture for urchins and grow a bunch of urchins and then put them out on a reef and see if that can help. One of the challenges is that certain types of algae, when they are small they're easier for certain types of fish to eat. But when they get big, they just become so unpalatable and nasty to eat that most things don't want to even try at all. And then it takes a hurricane, actually, to rip them out.
Neat. Another anonymous question. Why did you pick corals as a research area?
Oh, well, I think they just, I can't even explain. They just fascinated me. And I had no idea that I would be so engaged by the microbes that were living in them. But maybe part of it was that, sort of like the turning over rocks thing. When I started realizing there were all these different kinds of microbes to find on corals, I got really excited. And they play pivotal roles in the health of that ecosystem, and it's a very important ecosystem, so it's easy to be inspired to work on it.
Neat. Quinn asks, how old were you when you started studying the oceans?
Oh, maybe maybe about, let's say, early 20s. Yeah.
Wow, so like last week?
That's very kind of you.
Let's see. Anonymous asks, how do polyps obtain calcium? Great question. A geochemistry question.
Oh, man. I don't think I even know the answer to that question. You win. I can find out and send you the answer.
From the seawater, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think probably from ions that are dissolved in seawater, but in terms of the process of how it brings in those ions and incorporates them into the calcium carbonate, I don't have a good,
another field to study. Yeah. Great. So actually, I'm going to ask, this question comes from me. I didn't send it through here, but I'm cheating and bypassing that. The times I've been on reefs, I'm just fascinated. Every reef I've been on has been amazing, crazy, good. Just like every cave I've been in has been amazing. They all have their own attributes and whatnot. But the thing that just always sticks with me is the very rare encounters with a shark, because most of the time I'm just looking for sharks, and I'm a little bit kind of crazy obsessed with them that way. Do you have any encounters you'd like to chat about? Or can you tell us you're pretty much cool with them and they're cool with you and people shouldn't worry so much?
Well, definitely that. I was someone who, when I would go swimming at the surface of the ocean before I learned to dive, I think I was permeated with the Jaws movie thing, and I always was paranoid that there was a shark right behind me. And then one of my first memories on my first dive was just laughing when I got to the bottom of the ocean, because I was just like, oh, you can see everything now. And unfortunately, what I've seen over time is that in most places, it's really hard to see a shark. And if you see a shark, it's probably a nurse shark. And they're really nice, but they're definitely not going to give you a problem. I think, on reefs, sharks, basically, all of the shark encounters I've had, they've come up and been curious, and then they've just gone away. Because usually on a reef, if I have to sample a small piece of coral, I'll have a leather punch that's used for taking a piece out of a belt or something, and a big hammer. And so I'll be banging, and it's like gong, 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 gong. And so if there are sharks around, sometimes they'll come and swim over and circle around me, and then they're like, oh, okay, it's just you gonging on the floor, whatever, and then they just go. So one time in the Galapagos, actually, because there are these basaltic formations and these coral colonies just dotting over some of the basaltic formations, I swam up and I was going to sample a coral colony, and instead of just a soft gong, it was like gong, 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 and then all of a sudden all these hammerheads started coming out of this basaltic formation, like 6 or 7 of them, and I was like, oh, this is the moment where I have a bad shark experience. And they just started like circling around me, and I was like, ah! And then they were like, okay, don't scare us again, and left. So I've had a variety of those. I don't work in like blue water though, I'm sure.
Well, thanks for that. I'm not going to sleep tonight now.
Don't go to the Northern Galapagos Islands.
I had to ask. So this question comes from Finn. Finn, that's a really cool name for follow-up on a shark question. Have you seen any strange effects on the wildlife living in the reefs, or are the animals fine?
Do you think Finn means following the flooding events, or just ever?
Is that what you think, Finn? Yeah?
Yeah, maybe?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I actually was not a member of our team, collected the samples after the flooding event, and they saw a lot of weird behaviors then, you know. Lobsters like to hide in cracks and crevices under coral colonies, and these lobsters were coming out and standing on top of coral colonies up as high as they could get in some places. So that's very weird behavior. And then the fish, you know, places where fishers would normally expect to find fish, they would be devoid of fish. So certain things like that. Yeah.
Cool. We'll make this the final question. It comes from Polyp, a great name. Where is the best place for your first dive?
Well, I would say someplace where you can just put your fins on and swim out so that you don't have to deal with getting on and off of a boat. That's the technical part of my answer. But, oh, and also someplace that's warm. Because if you go dive in someplace really cold, you might want to get out of the water unless you have appropriate, really thick wetsuits on. So I would go someplace warm, go offshore, and then just anywhere, because you'll be amazed. It's so much fun to go.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So we're going to do our door prizes now, but let's thank Adrienne for an amazing talk.
Thank you, guys.